Today, our webinar is titled The Power of Metrics and Handoffs in Eliminating Waste and Maximizing Profits. Key performance metrics drive behavior. Mature companies are intentional when establishing, measuring, and communicating metrics in a cascading manner, from executives to employees. A key performance indicator is any measure that is significant in understanding how the business is performing and making decisions that will drive business success forward. During our session today, we will focus on two complementary aspects of a project-driven company. The first is the impact of the interdependencies and key handoffs which must occur to successfully sell, implement, manage, transition, and close projects within a mature systems integration company. The second highlights the Lean Six Sigma methodology, which chiefly targets eliminating waste and variation to increase efficiencies, save time in rework, reduce callbacks, and reduce break, fix, warranty, and service calls. I'm Jillian Bateman, ESA's Chief Development Officer, and I'm excited to lead this webinar today. Before we dive in, I'd like to provide some tips for those of you joining us on your very first ESA webinar. Welcome. You will be muted for the duration of this session, but that doesn't mean we don't want to hear from you. If a question or comment comes to mind at any point during today's session, click the Q&A or chat icon at the bottom of your interface, and I'll ensure we save some time for your questions with our experts today. We'll also be recording today's webinar, so you can rewatch the on-demand session and share it with your colleagues. Tomorrow, you'll receive an email thanking you for your attendance today with a link to the recording as well as today's slides. If you enjoy quality content and best practice sharing, ensure you mark your calendars for the Electronic Security Expo this June in Fort Worth, Texas. The event is designed by and for the pro-installed electronic security and life safety channel. And with over 30 sessions driven by panels of integrators and dealers, paving the ways in areas like reducing truck rolls, managing attrition, cash flow, and more, your leadership is sure to find tactical advice to bring back to the business. We at ESA realize your time is valuable, and we appreciate you spending some of that time with us today. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our experts from Solutions 360. Bradford Dempsey. He is the CEO and founder of Solutions 360 and is the primary architect of the Q360 ERP platform. He has 40 years of international project, sales, technical, and financial management experience. Brad regularly works Solutions 360's clients from across North America, Europe, and Australia to increase their gross and net profitability from an information and metrics-driven perspective, creating the opportunity for his clients to make informed decisions with measurable outcomes. We're also joined by Bradley Malone. Brad currently serves as both Vice President of Consulting for Navigate Management Consulting and Vice President of Professional Services for Solutions 360. His expertise is in organizational excellence and project management consulting. He has managed large development and integration projects and directed process improvements as both an executive and a consultant. Brad is the architect and presenter of standard-setting management training programs for numerous organizations, including the Project Management Institute, AVIXA, NSCA, ISE, CEDIA, ProSource, and PSA Security. He has trained over 25,000 participants globally and consulted with over 100 system integration companies, ranging in size from 2 million to 1 billion, increasing their effectiveness, efficiencies, and profitability. I'm excited to dive into this one. Brad, I'll let you take it away.
Thanks very much, Jillian. We're very excited on behalf of both Brad Malone and I. Very excited to be here today to be able to present to ESA. So let's get this rolling. All right, what we're going to talk to today obviously is about key performance indicators. we want you to walk away with at least a desire to expand or to increase your use and your understanding of KPIs, and to explore different ways you can use KPIs to help manage your business. So we'll talk about the concepts. Streamlining key handoffs is a very important part. And then my esteemed colleague, Brad Malone, who is a pioneer in the quality movement, is going to talk about Lean and Six Sigma methodology. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about examples of metrics in action. We'll follow that with a short Q&A. And remember, knowledge isn't power. It's the right knowledge at the right time, which is power. All right. So obviously a metric, we've all heard of performance indicators. And what we're focusing on here is key performance indicators. You can easily get bogged down with too many measurements and too many performance indicators. And they tell us how we're meeting the goals of the business. They also provide information to the management team, and they assist the team in making business decisions. Key performance indicators are truly the path to effective management. And as I touched on, we can measure anything. We can measure a lot of things, but selecting and using the right metrics that align with our strategic goals and the goals of the company are the key to make key performance indicators as effective as possible. All right. So the first thing to talk about is the idea of lag and lead measures. So we've got this uniquely green house here. And this is a lag measure because we know that something's happened. We have a greenhouse. These are things which can't be changed after the fact. They exist at a point in time. Then we have lead measures. So we have a bucket of paint, it's green, and we have a paintbrush. So in this case, we actually had an opportunity to stop this house from becoming this unique shade of green. So that's a leading measure. And it's something we talk about as being a lever. It's a way of making decisions and making changes before we actually get to our lag measures. So a lot of commonly used KPIs we will see in our financial reports. And I'm sure everybody's familiar with most of the ones here on the left side of this slide. We see these regularly on a monthly, annual basis in our income statements, balance sheets, et cetera. And they're measures of past activity. But what about our pipeline, our sales funnel? There are key performance indicators in there, which we've seen many companies can improve upon and use to help drive improvements in our KPIs. Our forecasts, are we planning our equipment deployments, our labor deployments? Backlog. Backlog is defined as the business that we have won that we have not yet delivered. And the movement of that backlog, not only how much backlog we have, but how it's growing or how it's shrinking, is a very important key indicator that we want to track. The importance of change orders, internal and customer change orders. Warranty and service calls. Now, our warranty costs after a project may be a lag indicator from that project, but they're also a lead indicator for our next project and the projects that follow that. And with
Thanks,
that,
Brad.
Pass over to Brad.
Thanks. And so with that background, we're going to move a little bit more into the structure of Lean and Six Sigma. So a lot of people confuse these words or find that they're special words, but they're essential to really driving quality in your organization. So when we look at Lean and Six Sigma, they're both after creating value. And value is, again, a capability provided to a customer, right time, right place, right cost, defined by that customer. And what I'd like you to think about for this session is that you have internal customers. How do we do and move something from sales to engineering to projects to installers to service? And really, are we viewing those people as our internal customers and driving quality to them? When we drive quality to our next person in line, we reduce cost and we actually increase the speed of delivery. So if that's value, what do we want to get rid of? And what we want to get rid of is waste. And waste is anything that's not value. So it's time, resources, space that gets in the way. So if you think back to Michelangelo carving David, and if we went back in time and asked him, how did you carve David? He probably would say, I took away everything that wasn't. And that's what I'd like you and Bradford would like you to think about throughout this session is how do we just start to peel back the onion and look at waste, not in a judgmental way, but in a what gets in the way of just driving value and quality. So when you think about lean has 4 goals. First is to, again, improve that quality. What's my customers' wants and needs, and then design and implement processes to meet their requirements. Jillian used the word mature several times in her introduction. Mature means, to me, non-judgmental. We're willing to look at how we do things, and we're willing to standardize. Again, we're typically North Americans. Most people here agree in standardization as long as I'm the standard. So mature companies really look at driving standards to the quality. With that, then, we want to eliminate waste. We want to reduce the time between steps. Again, that time is a waste. And then we want to reduce the total costs. So those are the 4 goals of lean we'll cover as we move through the session. So when we think about Six Sigma, lean is about waste. Six Sigma is about variation. And one of its primary principles, and so a lot of people think about lean and Six Sigma from a manufacturing context, but anything that is repeatable has these 2 concepts in them. If I'm terminating thousands of wires a year, those aren't project, those are process related. And all work occurs in a system of interconnected process. And then once you have that, we have variation. What we want to start to do is reduce variation down to something that's tolerable and then predictable. So again, we're reducing costs, improving customer satisfaction. Six Sigma uses a process called DMAIC. So it's design, measure, analyze, improve, and then control. And that's kind of a philosophy that's very structured and it's a problem-solving process. So it doesn't have to be difficult or convoluted. They're basic premises that I think we sometimes get scared of. So let's continue down that path. So, and then we'll move pretty quickly, but Six Sigma, it's named after statistical concept. You don't have to know the statistics to play with it, but it's basically saying we are generating the next output in our system or process so that we're ensuring that we're going to have less than or equal to 3.4 defects per million. So if we were doing 1 million terminations, we would only have 3.4 outside of the range of our predictability. So this means that we have high standards, but also very repeatable standards. So when you think about that, our goal is to lower variation. Lean is about lessening waste. Six Sigma is about lowering variation. And then high consistency. So again, think about training in your organization. If we send somebody out to put a monitoring device in or put a camera in or put a door in, are we going to get the same product by different people? That's Six Sigma. So let's look at an example. Pizza delivery. So customers want their pizza delivered fast. Everybody says that. That's great. Our guarantee is 30 minutes or less. Well, that's wonderful. We average over time, we look at performance and found an average delivery time was 23.5 minutes. Everybody then ought to be happy because, I mean, we're beating our 30 minutes or less guarantee because our average says so and our customers are all happy. Again, that's that one point. Let's look at variation. If we looked at the totality of that delivery, we can see that X, being the mean, is that 23.5. And then 30 is our goal. But look at that blue area. We've got a full 20% of our deliveries outside of 30, some going on to 50. So are our customers happy? I would say 20% of them definitely aren't. And so the goal behind Six Sigma is let's look at that variation and try and drive it down. So managing just the average doesn't tell the whole story. It's the average and the variation. And so I'd like you to think about when you send technicians out in the field, when you look at estimating, are we looking at the average? Are we looking at the variation and the range within that variation? So the goal of Six Sigma is to drive that blue there to now down to here. How do we narrow that range? So now we only have 5% that are outside of that variation. And then how do we continue to narrow that and move it again further to the left? So some math in here, but the concept is between the two, reduce waste and then reduce variation. So given that conversation, and again, please chat if you have questions. We want to understand the impact of key handoffs within a project's life cycle, because those are really impacted by Lean and Six Sigma. So I'll say most of you, some of you were probably in a firm, and we wish we could have you raise hands, but you can raise hands and we'll feel you raising your hands. But how many of you were in your company way back when there were 3 or 4 or 5 people all in a van? You sold, you delivered, you got paid, you knew what everybody was thinking because you were stuck in the same van with the same people all the time, and it just worked out well. We all had, quote, common sense. Then we started to grow, and we started to grow typically in these kind of org structure conversations. The person that sold before now had more people selling for them. The person that made it happen, ops, they now had installers, they had integrators, they also had people who monitored. And then we had the admin people who were finance, all that. And then one of them might have been the owner. So we just start to grow in kind of an Amway conversation, grow down. The challenge is that the organization starts to build silos. And we can go into that structure. And I'd just like you to think about in your organization, if you're 20, 30, 50 people, where did our silos start to come from? And do we sometimes point passive fingers at one another and start to think about we as sales and them as ops versus we as a company? So this is an example of where we start to play with handoffs. And this is an org structure view. But your organization, I think, probably looks more like this, where you've got a company strategy, a mission, a culture, again, set. And those are typically carried from those 4 people in a van. But I've got the same colors here. I've got forecast, all those things up front. In some companies, we do risk analysis after we win it and say, oh, maybe we shouldn't have won that. And then I've got all the blue, which is the operations or integration, and then all the green, which is kind of holding it all together. So again, don't get a lot of feedback, but what does your brain say when you look like this? So is this complexity understood? And this complexity occurs whether it's a $5,000 project or whether it's a $500,000 project. $5,000 projects cause a whole lot more pain and drama in terms of percentage. If you think about selling a house, the same stack of mortgage paperwork is there, whether it's a $50,000 house or a $500,000 house. So all these steps are typically done in a project. So when you think about one project, let's add 20 projects all occurring at the same time because summer's coming. And then some of you have more locations that share resources across locations. And then some of you share resources between projects and service. So when you start to think about where's our mental map when we look at this, and this is where definitely Lean and Six Sigma will come to play. So a concept we'd like you to think about is that time marches on. And again, it's very much about moving something from sales through. We'll talk more about process, but what does it cost the company and its employees, both salaried and hourly? And I'll read that, but downstream from one another in terms of time, money, productivity, morale, and opportunity cost. If somebody downstream had to fix something, what's the opportunity cost of what's the cost of what they had to give up? So this is where we come back to customer. Are our upstream people treating the downstream people as their customer, or are they treating them like their cleanup crew? So when some person upstream cannot take that 5 minutes extra to do it correctly, according to the person downstream, what's it cost the company? So if you think about, it takes $10 of revenue, if we're a 10% net company, $10 of revenue to generate $1 of net profit. But every dollar we save, and save doesn't mean remove people or scrimp or do anything like that. It's just about putting quality in, getting waste and variation out. So every dollar of cost savings drives $1 in net profit. We've all heard that money doesn't grow on trees, but what if we don't waste the money that's growing on the tree? So let's look at some key handoffs in an organization. These, and again, I've trained thousands of people. These are typically the big 3. So we look at sales as the blue line. We look at design engineering, and you could have people pre or post. We've got project management as the umbrella that takes that over from sales. And the orange lines are all the people that really get the work done. So cable rough, all those words. And then at the end, we commission. We may have the same people who design it come commission it. And then we've got that transition to service, which is sometimes called a drop off, or we ring the doorbell and run. And then sales comes back at the end. And if it's done well, should take credit for it because that's a referral and a next sale. Then we've got all the supporting roles, which many of us don't know what they do anyway. So procurement, finance, admin. So what's the cost when those three handoffs are not done well? So I'd like you to ponder in your own organization, do we treat the person downstream well, or do we treat the person downstream again as somebody who will clean up after us? And what does that 5 minutes cost up front when sales goes back and forth to design, when we have a project that's won, but we don't have a kickoff meeting, we don't look through the drawings well. So that 5 minutes up front tends to become 5, 10, 50 hours by the time it comes to service. And then do we see service as an afterthought, or do we see projects as just an avenue to get to service? So projects are transitory, services for the next 10 years. Do we treat our service department like that? So does each role really understand their responsibility in making their key handoffs successful? That's really the goal that we want to talk to. Bradford's going to come back at the end and talk through metrics that are driven by each of these departments. And again, we'll wait for chat to come in. What I also see in organizations is that in many of the companies I've worked with, we go back in time, they're very adrenaline based. So let's go. And we win something. We don't really plan it because we've done it before, and let's just again go make it happen. So we dive in, but we don't dive in fast because we have other fires to put out. So many of you are in a shared resource pool, and again, a project-driven organization. We love to firefight, so we often reward firefighting. So again, many of you may be Bradford's and my age, and in this industry and systems integration, I find that people look way older than they need to before their time because they've just been heroically firefighting. We also find at the end that we collapse and then we do it all over again and we move to martyrdom. So I'd like you to think about how many of your organizations truly reward heroism / martyrdom, or do they really reward mature projects? So we slow down at the beginning to speed up later. And again, working with hundreds of companies, I've typically seen a 20 to 30% reduction in the amount of labor needed in projects because of just the reduction of waste, callbacks, waiting, all those things that come from lean. So one, we get the correct design, we actually plan, and then we execute control, and we transition as opposed to ring the doorbell and run to service. And then throughout, we're doing lessons learned. So I'd like you to think about, what data are you tracking as an organization? What information are you sharing back to the people? And oftentimes in many organizations, we track time, but rarely do we go back up to estimation and actually change the estimate or change the estimating database. What lessons are we learning? So a project team will do a postmortem, but did we actually take what they learned and share it with everyone else? I find the distinction again with a mature company is that they're really looking at learning, not judging. And then what behaviors are you rewarding? I find a lot of organizations reward heroism, in which case I'm just fostering poor planning, versus why don't we periodically reward the project that just went smoothly, that was run with planning, that was run maturely. It had changes, it had variance, many of the metrics Bradford talked about, but we understand that it's done in a mature fashion to learn from versus having to relearn the same mistake, which definitely turns into martyrdom. And then the goal is, where are we improving? So if you look at a life cycle, it's got 20, 25 steps. And again, all of you are familiar with most of these. Each of these can be standardized. So when I say standardized, I don't mean robotic. Standardized means that we can put in a common practice, and then we learn from it and we improve it. So proposals, how we move through. And again, all of you are familiar with that. And this matches the stars that we were really looking at before and those key handoffs. But each of these can be measured. Each again can be standardized and improved upon. And then we want to look at measuring the cost of each of those. So the goal again being, what does it cost to do a needs analysis or site survey? I find lots of organizations don't take the time to do site surveys. And then when the installers show up, that building was way uglier than we thought, and labor went up by 10, 20%. I find site surveys typically save at least 10% of labor just by having one. How are we doing job tracking? Again, each of these pieces is something we can measure. We can measure the quality of each, and the better the quality, typically higher quality reduces costs when you think about it in Lean Six Sigma terms. So let's move into some tools we could use throughout then. So when you think of a process, and again, some companies, mature companies use that word as just a normal word. Immature companies tend to not like that word. But a process is made up of 8 things. Whether your process is tying your shoes in the morning, getting your kids out to school, terminating a wire, again, putting in a security system for a company or home, all these 8 aspects. So the time, machine, the methods of how we do it, energy, measurement, all those. Just notice that personnel is just 1/8 of what makes up a process. And yet we'll tend to look at someone and say, they're awesome, they're special. Well, if they're awesome and special, let's copy what they do, because those 8 things make up an activity or a process, which is how we do things. When we do things, again, that goal should be transforming based on our customer requirements. And those then build out a product or a service, the output of that, whether it's a well-tied shoe or a correctly terminated wire, a correctly mounted camera. But that product or service will either meet or not meet the defined quality standard, which sales and engineering develop for us. When it's in compliance, yay, we serve the person downstream, we serve service, and we serve our ultimate customer. When that's not, then we have to redo and fix, and that's a waste cost. So let's do an example of a small restaurant, and Bradford and I'll work in it. And so we're just doing breakfasts, and we got a couple tables out front, and so we're baking toast. The toast comes out a little too dark from what we want, but we've been told that not to touch the toaster, nor have we ever been trained how to do it. So then one of us scrapes off the toast. If we scrape off the toast, all the heat goes off. So now we have to put it in the oven and heat it up to put the butter back on. Well, that's great. It's just the 2 of us. We can make that happen. But now we've doubled the size. So now we have to bring another person in, and part-time their work is actually now scraping toast and buttering it and putting it in the oven and butter it. Now we're a 100-table restaurant. And so we have a full-time toast scraper, and we have a full-time put-in oven and butterer. Now we're a 5-restaurant shop, and we've got a vice president of toast scraping and a vice president of put-in oven and toast buttering. These are awesome people. Their position descriptions are well written. They do their job perfectly. But when you think about it, how much of their role is really just waste because we didn't do root cause and just turn down the toaster? So I know it's either a funny or a sad story there, but I'd like you to look around your organization and just, again, non-judgmentally, start to assess how many of the roles that we have that are typically downstream did we add to actually fix somebody's upstream waste. So when you think about processes, we look at the ones on the left, reliability, quality, all those types of things, predictability, smooth handoffs, collaboration. And I'd just like you to do a quick measurement of what you're seeing here. Versus redo, delay, we're just, again, money is one factor, but you want to think morale, you want to think energy, how much double work, how much uncertainty, again, and ultimately that finger pointing and blame. I'm in the Midwest, so we're passive aggressive when we finger point. But ultimately, you're going to get that martyrdom feel of it's always been this way. So again, a mature company moves to that non-judgmental view. A couple other ways to look at tools are value stream maps. This is called a swim lane chart. If you've seen one, again, the wonderful thing about the internet is all these tools are available pretty much for free. So a swim lane chart, if you look at the Olympics, but every role has their lane. And then the goal is, if I'm sales, and I'll do a deeper dive here, but sales hands off to engineering, engineering hands it back. Engineering, once sales wins it, goes up to the customer and down, and it moves through this kind of follow the yellow brick road. This is a great post-it exercise with string inside your organization. And the thing to start looking at is how many redo loops do we have? or how many things downstream are just really fixing that upstream. Again, 5 minutes not done correctly upstream turns into 5 to 10 to 20 hours downstream. So if you look at a blow up of one of those areas, each handoff inside of a swim lane, it has a deliverable which needs to meet a quality standard. And that quality standard is basically dictated or required by the person downstream. So these are incredibly powerful tools, especially for those of you who are redesigning your organization. Many of us have a fictional view of the way it used to be. And that may have been when there were 3 of us in a van, but now on 20, 30, 40 people, the myth is not the reality. Another tool is called the spaghetti diagram. And here's just a quick example of something like procurement. So if I look at a warehouse, the top one is how it was. So it's often viewed by like follow the mouse or tie a string to the back of you and watch people walk around. If you look at a kitchen, most of us have a kitchen where the oven and the refrigerator and the sink are in this nice triangle. If you don't have one of those, you probably hate your kitchen. So how do we streamline the movement? So again, what does our warehouse look like? Is it just a meandering, or is it circular? Is it having a wonderful flow? So again, lots of opportunities to just look at time. How many people again are in that warehouse picking process? Do we allow PMs to go in just to pick stuff because they're out there anyway? And then we have to look at how much piracy is occurring. What's our rack fab area look like? Again, how are projects staged? How are vans laid out? What's our RMA? So all these questions, and notice that I can ask these judgmentally, but the goal is to ask these very non-judgmentally. It's just about how do we learn? Okay. Another tool, and again, we're moving through quickly, so appreciate it. That's why you'll have the recording and the slides, but it's called the cause and effect diagram, sometimes called a fishbone diagram, or Ishikawa after the person in Toyota who developed it. But I look at, if I have a problem, what's the effect? And then peel back, was it because we didn't give that person enough time? Was it because they didn't have the right equipment or the right training? They didn't have the right incoming materials or energy. We measured incorrectly. A great book to read, Jim Collins' Good to Great. I would put that on my mandatory reading list. But I find so many companies, and I'm on wire termination as a quick example. Every one of their techs has a different termination tool. Well, then how can we start to measure variance and truly root cause when I haven't standardized the tools that we use? So again, simple things that will impact tremendously. Again, if I'm doing 50,000 wires a year and I take 10 seconds off each wire, that added up to money, but it's also an opportunity cost of, I can't hire enough people as it is, but what if we just got the waste out? So again, it enables the team to focus on the content of a problem. It can also, for anybody doing process improvement, focus the team on the causes of both the problem, but also the opportunities to improve. The 80-20 rule, again, simple things, but 80% of the problems are from 20% of the causes. This includes both processes and, I'll say, sadly, people. But you look at, again, managing the vital few. Bradford and I were talking about golf, and we looked at many of us, it's summer, spring's coming, so we're all looking for golfing. We might go out and take a lesson. We'll go, and the golf pro will say, well, let's check your grip and your stance. And we go, And then after the lesson, we say, I need new shoes. So we go buy new shoes, and we need a new pro. So we go to the second pro, and he's like, let's look at your grip and your stance. And we listen. And then after that, we go get new clubs, because that has to be the problem. So I'd encourage you to look at in your organization, are we truly looking for the true root cause? And sometimes root cause are some of those people who've been there a long time, who've just had it their way for a long time. Special people are part of the 20% that cause a lot of problems. And the last aspect that I'll do, and then I'll turn it over to Brad, is Kaizen, which is typically small continuous improvement. And how do we take another second off a wire? How do we stage well? How do we make sure that our consumables, when people go to Grainger or Home Depot and buy stuff because they didn't have it, do they take their receipt back to expenses, to payroll, or do we take it back to the warehouse and say, look at what you didn't have in the warehouse that then sent us? So every Home Depot run costs $500 before I buy the part. A huge place to just look at how do we improve continuously? How do we get time back? And the challenge, how do we save time? Because again, we never get time back. So Kaizen, a key tool involved in Lean and Six Sigma. So I'm going to transition to Bradford to talk through examples of metrics in action.
Thanks, Bradley. If I could ask you a quick question.
Yeah.
We hear a lot about Kaizen and Lean and Six Sigma, but it's usually in reference to manufacturing.
Yes.
What's your experience in the integration world and how well it fits?
I find I think people use that as an excuse so they don't have to measure things. That's by one. So sorry if I'm blunt, folks. The second is anything repeatable you can apply Lean and Six Sigma to it. And so we tend to look at projects always have a uniqueness to them, but the process that we follow is highly, highly similar. How do we estimate? How good are our kickoff meetings? Do we have kickoff meetings? Do we update our agenda? How well are our vans structured and stocked? Well, everybody has their own van. Yeah, does every van have to look like a dorm room? So I find anything that's repeatable is key to follow the construct of Lean and Six Sigma. And what I also find in this industry, which is to me the really cool thing, is that our projects aren't 10 years long. And if we're doing 50 to 100 to 500 projects a year, and many of them are 3 weeks long, 4 weeks long, man, what would the improvement look like if we just standardized on those things that are repeatable?
Goes back to talks about portfolios of projects as opposed to individual projects.
Absolutely. Yeah. And all of that. And that's a whole nother concept in terms of like ERP. And I think hopefully we'll be invited back to give some more presentations.
We'll see how we do. So let's dive into some KPIs. This is not an exhaustive list by any stretch. We've divided it into some of the major sections that we want you to look at. And I'm not going to go through and read each KPI. I'm just going to touch on some of them and just give you some things to think about if you're measuring these KPIs and some ways you might want to use them. Obviously, order booking, new orders. Now, one of the keys with all of the KPIs we're going to be talking about is having a consistent definition and method and how you create and measure these KPIs. We know from experience that in some companies, an order is considered a booked order when it starts with a quote and a sales opportunity and gets converted into an order. In other companies, it's simply, there could be an order desk where they're taking orders. So even defining the orders you want to track, the types of orders and how they start is going to be important. Gross margin, gross profit. Margin is a percentage, profit is a dollar value. Sometimes it doesn't matter what the gross margin is if it's a smaller deal and the profit's not there. But then you're probably looking at a book of business and you're looking at portfolios again instead of individuals. Obviously, it's easier to sell more business to an existing customer than to get a brand new customer, so your repeat customer. The sales funnel, having a structured process, and the way we look at a sales funnel, it's a lot like the way you would look at a project plan for running a project. Having a structured process for the way your salespeople engage their prospects gives you the ability to improve that process, to get the feedback on when you win, when you lose, when deals get stuck. But it also gives you the ability to have a more definitive probability of close. If you know you've gone through the same 3 steps, when you look at an opportunity that's 50% probability of close, you have a much better idea about what's gone on and where that sales opportunity really sits. Wallet share of existing customers, again, that's building into our customer base, mix of business, and obviously the accuracy of that projected pipeline. Next. So, simple question. I've got 2 deals here. ABC company, 100 grand in revenue, 70,000 in cost of goods sold. That should leave me with my gross profit. XYZ company, 110,000 in revenue, 70,000 in cost of goods sold. So the question becomes, which deal is more profitable? The correct answer is we have no idea. Why do we have no idea? Well, cost of goods sold doesn't have a really strict definition. In some customers, they are not including their project management expense in their cost of goods sold. Others, executives who help out on the job, are not booking their time and their cost against it. Then on top of that, we have this idea of labor cost. And if I pay somebody $25 an hour, I need to burden that cost on top of what I pay them as their salary to deal with their utilization, their holidays that they spend, their payroll taxes, their benefits, and all those other extra overhead expenses. So my burdened labor needs to be calculated and measured on a regular basis. A lot of companies will just take a number out of the air and guess at what burdened labor is. It's something that you should be looking at, comparing to the extra costs and making sure your burdened rates are as accurate as possible, so you can estimate and measure as accurately as possible. Next. And we love dashboards because we don't want to sit down and be looking through a long report for a needle in a haystack. What we want to do is whatever system we use, and I don't care whether you use Excel, a different software package, whatever, we want our system to push things to us that we need to pay attention to. So if we know our normal margins are between 25 and 35%, we should be driven to look at all of those deals which are below 25 or over 35. Quite often, it's just as dangerous having a deal that's too high a margin because we might have missed things. Next. So what about operations? Well, labor capacity. I don't know how many people track this very well, but what we want to be able to do is look at our labor and divide it into labor types. So a labor type might be an installer. It might be an engineer. Each of those labor types represents some capacity. That capacity is defined by their normal working hours. And then you subtract things like their paid time off. You subtract holidays. You might subtract this potential sick days and their productivity. They then have skills, and you need to map that capacity to the skills that you need to be accomplished. So an engineer might be able to do design, but they might also be doing commissioning. So you need to map that capacity to the demand, which is the type of work you need done, to measure your utilization and productivity and drive that to be as billable as possible. And by billable, we mean work that is directly related to revenue generating activities. So we touched on labor capabilities, process validity. We're big believers in checklists. Another book to recommend is the Checklist Manifesto. You know, checklists help create that adherence to process consistency. Tracking overtime correctly, labor over and under allocation. Again, I'm not going to go through it and read all of these. These are just some of the key metrics that we would like you to think about. And as we said, you're going to have a copy of this presentation, so you can look at each of these in a little more detail. And again, an operations dashboard. We should have a dashboard for each role. And the role has their responsibilities, and that role will not only be looking at their own KPIs, but quite often they're looking at leading indicators from that upstream or downstream position. Remember, those other people in our company are our customers, and we're the customer of somebody else. So we want to keep an eye on the inputs and outputs as well throughout these dashboards and while we're measuring these KPIs. Next. All right, project management. Actually, Bradley, I want to ask you a quick question here. We've seen this happen frequently, and maybe you can comment on how somebody gets great project management. We've seen a lot of cases where people take their best technical people and they need to promote them because they're afraid of losing them, or the person wants to grow, and they move this key technical person into a project management role. What usually happens?
One, they get incredibly frustrated. So, and two, I find that many PMs are recovering lead technicians. So their first mode of operation is to grab their tool belt and go fix the problem. So we tend to not just take our lead techs, we take our most heroic lead techs. And so we don't reward people for planning. And a huge piece of project management is planning and confronting when there's a disconnect between the plan and reality. So and I'll tend to have most lead techs are not very confrontational.
So where do I find good project managers?
I find them, I've done this for several companies recently. People laugh at me, but meeting planners, wedding planners, coordinators, many of your projects in this industry and a lot in systems integration, I don't need the technical skill to manage the project. I have technical skill. And then the goal of, I promote people up it's like, why do I not have just a lead tech track that continues to grow and then moves into design engineering as opposed to project management?
Right.
And so when I look at these, and again, you and I could spend an hour on many of these, I'll jump on these, but what's my status versus progress versus forecast? Many of us talk about status reports, but when we were kids and we were driving someplace with our parents, rarely were we asking where we at. We were always asking, when will we get there? So I think it's also that key perspective of having people understand what I'm measuring and why, and how do I get ahead of the trend. One of the things you talked about in measuring, and again, we're not going to go through the list, but the challenge of how we measure. So I find many of us measure project managers by the color of the project. And if it's a green project, you're good. If it's red, you're bad. And then what I do is I start promoting or condoning people who lie or build Ponzi schemes. You know, this project's already terrible. We'll just add hours to this one, so this will make this one look good. And then we lost the veracity of our data. So I'd always encourage you to think about that the color of the project doesn't tell me how well it's being managed, the truth of the color. And again, that's a core kind of fundamental that you talked about earlier about metrics. Because when I start rewarding the answer I already want, I start to build from a PM perspective what I call the watermelon culture. All projects look really, really good, and you don't have to cut deep before they're red. And oftentimes we find out at the 90 percentile that this project's gone over budget, and then we can't manage it at all. We're just reacting to it. And then, as you were talking, there's dashboards from that perspective. So sorry, you let me in. I had to chat on that one. That's my kind of my claim to fame. So thank you.
The only other one I wanted to mention on that previous slide, I'll just mention very quickly.
Oh, please.
Is WIP. And
Yep.
I think this is really important because WIP, work in progress, is normally for a lot of companies a list of their projects with some different KPIs for each of those projects, like percent complete, number of labor hours, et cetera. And WIP is normally a point in time report. What I think is very important with WIP reports is to also have a delta report, because what you want to see is a change in the WIP report since the previous report. You want to see the slope, the change. If I start to lose margin, I'm going to probably start to lose it a little bit at a time. And I want to catch that as soon as I start to lose. And that's that variance aspect that we're talking about.
Absolutely. And one of the,
as early as possible.
Yeah. Right? Trend lines become trend lines because they're called trend lines. You know, that's and then deep. The myth, that's you know, it's like, that's why that's the word. Yeah. But many people will say, it'll get better. Well, by what? Well, we'll be heroic. So I spent the weekend working overtime, but I didn't track my time because I didn't want the project to go over, but now I'm exhausted and the next project suffered. So again, we always want to track reality.
And that's not scalable.
It is not scalable.
It's not a way to grow. Yeah. All right, procurement. Again, we're not going to go through all of these. I think one of the keys is managing ETAs. It may not seem like a big thing, but when we're planning projects and we're planning labor, the worst thing that can happen is you have labor and you don't have the material there at the right time, the right place for that labor to be executed, because labor is our most costly component. It's one we have the most control over. So getting ETAs from your vendors, getting those ETAs matched up with the request dates, and getting that information into the hands of your project managers while they have time to reschedule and make changes is absolutely critical.
And a lot of these, I'll say, expedited shipment, we didn't plan.
Right. And another dashboard.
So when, you know, as a close, these are just some examples. So thank you, Brad, for the metrics. Is every metric has some, again, indicator that ought to be against a goal or against an improvement opportunity, or how do we reduce waste? So again, in terms of warehouse, how well do we stage? Do people just go and pick parts? How much piracy is occurring? How many parts runs do I have? How many consumables, again, drive parts runs? Or we're sitting there tracking zip ties and counting zip ties, or we don't hand them out enough because people might waste a zip tie. Well, that hour that they wasted to go to Home Depot definitely paid for a couple hundred zip ties. Again, we talked about procurement already. Terminations is kind of one of my fetishes recently. Labeling. Do we label well? Do we label for service? Callbacks, who did what to whom? And callbacks, oftentimes we don't send the same crew back when we do a callback. So how well documented did the crew leave the site for the next site to inherit? And then the best way to keep a project on budget is just to give it to service early. So that's a gift that keeps on giving. RMAs, how often are we out there and leaving RMAs in people's vans for 6 months? Oh, now I remember it. And now we can't return it back to the vendor. So now we have a third of our warehouse taking up just with gray stock or things we'll sell someday. And then I'd also look at time card and expense reports. Talking about WIP, Bradford, if we think about tracking and we're 2 weeks behind in our tracking, then we're 2 weeks behind in our WIP, and it's really hard to measure in a rearview mirror. So again, no matter what the tool, do we have discipline, and are we telling the truth in our time cards and our expense reports? So when you think about the conversation, key performance indicators give us direction, they give us the measure. Lean Six Sigma gives us the tools, capability, the mindset to look for, one, quality, but also waste and variation. And again, we want to empower people, involve people into the improvement. I learned a long time ago, those people within 6 to 12 feet of something that's occurring are way clearer on what's occurring than the person who did it 20 years ago that's sitting in an office. So we want to active participant, engaged, accountable. We want to build trust. Trust is done through transparency. We tell the truth about things. So to me, truth early with options is now mature management. Reactive after the fact and blame definitely isn't. Each person is important within that model of every person upstream has a customer downstream. When you think about service and the closed loopedness of it, services customer is sales. When we have a service department, monitoring department that's awesome, we'll generate sales for our organization. So again, that's that closed loop model. And everyone, as Bradford showed, dashboards, metrics, every metric, I'll call it, has a belly button. It has a person who needs to own that and be accountable, count onable to drive that metric in the performance that we want to drive. So ultimately, we increase employee effectiveness and deliver results that are intended results versus accidental. So that's really what we would like to think about. We appreciate the time with you. Jillian, we've left some time for questions. And Bradford, any final thoughts before we open it up for other people?
Yeah, maybe we could finish off with tomorrow morning rolls around and I've seen this presentation or I've read it. Where do I start? What's the first thing I do tomorrow morning?
I would look at one, as an organization, get rid of your ego. Many people have been around, they don't like to hear the truth, or they don't, because many people invented the processes that are being worked on. And so smile, also begin with the 5 whys. So look at any problem that you're having. This takes too long. So an example, commissioning is taking too long. Well, what does that mean? And then how do we drive that back? Well, commissioning takes too long because the commissioners are actually fixing the functionality of the tool or the piece of equipment. Well, why are they doing that? Well, because the wires weren't toned correctly. Well, why weren't the wires toned? Well, because we were in a hurry when we were back in rough install and didn't actually follow the checklist. So it's why did that occur? What caused that to occur? And just start to do that 3 or 4 times across the organization. You don't have to have the same people, but I promise you, each organization here has 3 or 4 things that are kind of low-hanging fruit. Don't go after the big problems because they're called big for a reason. But how do we do low-hanging fruit and then just go solve? So I think empowering people to speak the truth, small areas, incremental things.
Great. And if there aren't any other questions, I've got another one for you.
All right.
So you've been in change management. You've worked with an awful lot of companies. What's the most difficult area of a company to change?
Executives. Sorry. It is what it is. Actually, the hardest people to change are the people just below the executives, because they see the rule book and they're waiting to go sit in those chairs. And then when we start changing things, we start changing the rules, and they're like, I like the rules the way they are until I sit in that chair. And then we can change the rules once I'm in that chair. So that level just below that executive management is the hardest ones to change. And then I'll say also back to change is difficult when our mirror is kind of fuzzy. So again, the emperor has no clothes. We're not gazing into the truth. It has to be a mature company that rewards the truth. And that's hard in some organizations that have people that we'll hurt their feelings, or we've always done it that way, or that type of thing. So the past is the hardest thing to change, or the myth of the past.
Right.
Great question. Thank you. Jillian, do we have any others from audience?
Hi, gentlemen. I'm sorry. I'm just reading
okay.
some that are coming in here.
Okay, great.
For a tool like this one, how does it work when you have a process that varies by geographic locations?
That one you'd have, so the measurement might differ, but it would be interesting to say process varies. So and then I would have to know more about that. But when I'm down in the midst of it, I'm still managing a project. I may have different steps. Go ahead, Brad.
Yeah, well, I would think that compliance might be one of the biggest reasons why it'd be different in different geographies.
Right.
And I think that's where you get into the idea of your process can include checklists, documentation, workflows, and you can vary those based upon a geographic location very easily so that they fit the sale type, the geography, and the compliance of that area.
So again, I could have a 1-star restaurant or a 5-star restaurant, but they all follow a process and a checklist.
Okay, great. We've got a lot of comments here
wow.
coming in about change management, which are funny, but not so much questions. Great point, Rich.
If people don't mind, Bradford and I are willing to take these. So awesome questions. Take these and kind of put them into a document, answer them, and give them back to you, Jillian, to send out to everybody.
I think that would be wonderful. You've talked about a lot here. So being able to unpack some of these things, I think folks would really appreciate, given the dialogue happening in the chat right now.
Yeah, I'm looking at it and like going, well, if we had another hour, I'd love to answer some. What I would encourage those of you who are in the chat, so I'm glad that Bradford and I were able to kind of turn on the brain power, is continue to write questions, and then we'll ensure to answer them. May not be tonight, but it'll be soon.
That sounds great. Oh, what kinds of tools do we have to create micro learning opportunities for the things discussed today?
Well, I think it's important to note that Navigate Management Consulting is a division of Solutions 360 that doesn't care what technology you use. It's just strictly consultants. You know, we have industry leaders working in that division who can provide you with oversights. They can help you manage operations meetings. They can look through your warehouse and help you improve that. So there's lots of opportunities for help there.
But I would also look at micro opportunities. I mean, especially Bradford and I tend to look similar given the age we are. So, but with many of the younger generation, if somebody's doing something well, record it and put it on YouTube. I mean, that's our standard. Mm-hmm. We normally have somebody in management write the standard who hasn't touched it for years, and the techs look at it and go, yeah, right. Well, how would you do it? Well, I do it this, this, and this. Well, then write it down. Well, hell, I don't want to write it down. Nobody writes anything down anymore. But let's just do a video that's 4 minutes long and then have somebody else transcribe it. But this generation doesn't read. I'm not saying they need to, when I can go watch somebody actually do it. So to me, those are incredibly easy micro learning. They don't have to be professionally done. It's just, here it is, and we're going to post it. And here's our process channel for our company.
Great point.
Yeah.
I want to be respectful of everyone's time. I'd like to thank Bradford and Bradley, Solutions 360, and Navigate Management Consulting for their expertise today and for running through this really interesting topic with our ESA members on today's call. It looks like we've got both Brad's email addresses there on the screen now, so you can absolutely send some questions their way if there are additional questions that you may have. And as a reminder, you will get the recording to today's webinar, both in video format and a download PDF version of the slides today, tomorrow in your email. So I want to thank everyone for joining us. We know your time's important. We appreciate it. And we'll see you all on the next ESA webinar. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you. Thanks, Jillian.
Thanks, Jillian.
Have a
Thanks,
good one.
attendees. Appreciate the opportunity.